100 centuries, the Tomperor has sat upon his golden throne, and by his will he commands over a gazillion jillion views, achieved by the strength of his inexhaustible army of goons. He is the fat-ass Italian writhing invisibly with power from the dark age of technology. He is the carry-out lord of the Tompire for which 1,000 souls shell out every day, so that he may never know poverty. There is no peace among the stars, only an eternity of game playing, recording, and video making, all for the laughter of thirsting gods. For in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only an endless selection of bitchin' 40k games to play. At least that's what a Tom Hammer 40,000 intro would sound like if I was gonna make one and read it, but sadly, I'm not famous or rich enough to make a Tom Hammer 40,000 rulebook, so gotta put this little baby aside. But since we are in the grim darkness of the not so far future, that finally brings us to today's subject, and that is of course Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine, developed by Relic Entertainment. As with our other reviews, we typically take a look at the developer's history and see where it leads us, and with the case of Relic Entertainment, it has quite a tumultuous history, from the very beginning to where we can find it now in the year of our Lord, 2024, which has a library of games ranging from space combat strategy games, animal mutilating clone stuff, the still to this day best 40k real-time strategy game ever made, and a decent foray into World War II real-time tactics. Being founded in Vancouver, British Columbia all the way back in 1997, Relic quickly got to work on creating one of the masterpieces of sci-fi space combat strategy in Homeworld, which has us taking the role of wayward exiles of humanity known as the Kushan, that after having the original Homeworld destroyed by an alien race for creating a hyperdrive, it has the Kushan searching for the original Homeworld of Hiigara. Homeworld, in my humble opinion, is a masterpiece of an RTS, not just for its gripping story of wayward exiles searching for home that reminds me a lot of Battlestar Galactica, but also because of the gameplay and visuals elevated what it meant to put your game into 3D space of, well, space. Soon after, in 2004, comes the first installment of my favorite series from Relic and one of my favorite strategy games of all time, in Warhammer 40,000 Dawn of War, which takes the age-old RTS formula but changes it up and by doing new ways of resource management, while also enjoying a fresh 40k coat of paint to showcase it all in. Dawn of War concerned the exploits of Gabriel Angelos, a captain of Relic's homebrew chapter of the Blood Ravens, which spans into even the lore of today. Joining the Blood Ravens are the nefarious Orks, the sly Eldar, and the filth of the traitor legions. Dawn of War would get 3 main expansions, those being Winter Assault, Dark Crusade, and Soulstorm, which added in the Imperial Guard, the Tau Empire, Necrons, and the Sisters of Battle and the Dark Eldars, respectively, to round off the series with an awesome amount of cool factions and units to play. Further on this timeline, we have Company of Heroes, released in 2006, which takes Relic's skills for strategy and narrowing the focus down to create an incredible real-time tactics experience that places a focus on individual squads going from cover to cover and adding in more complex mechanics for suppression, flanking, and so on to make the game feel more realistic. Company of Heroes has the Americans as the main faction for the Allies, while on the Axis there is of course the Germans with their Panzen Fricken Puppen Faden Gesellschaft mechanics, which is much too barbarian for me to get into. Though in the opposing fronts expansion they add in the British Expeditionary Forces for the Allies, and then for the Axis, hold on, let me get my notes around here, something like, yeah, they just get more Germans. Now, I'm not gonna lie fellas, while I admit I am much more partial to 40k instead of World War II, there were so many mechanics added in by Company of Heroes that I should be eternally grateful for it, because it led to the development of my favorite game from Relic, and that is of course 2009's Warhammer 40,000 Dawn of War 2. Dawn of War 2 puts us back in the boots of the Blood Ravens chapter of Astartes and has you controlling a force commander, no, not that force commander, and leading 3 squads of the Blood Ravens' finest, ranging from Tarkus's Tactical Marine Squad, Thaddeus's Assault Marines flying high in the sky, and Avitus's Devastator Squad slugging out giant nasty balls of plasma, and of course to cap it all off we have the ever-moody, hardcore, sniper type in Cyrus, voiced by the ever-present Steve Bloom. This force of blood ravens will hop around subsector Aurelia contending with an Ork WAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAA Elite Leviathan drops his nasty Tyranids for you to enjoy killing. Of note is the addition of the Tyranids, because while a tabletop faction you could pick dating all the way back to the origins of 40k, this is the first time that they show up as a playable faction in a 40k video game. The campaign for Dawn of War 2 is one that I have replayed many times over, not just for the fact that all the squad leaders are kind of like ARPG characters that you can level up and equip with new cool gear, but also because the experience can be shared by doing it cooperatively, which is something that my fine co-host Andrew have been doing, and we should honestly probably get back to it one of these days. Filled with secrets and intrigue, the narrative dips its toes into the orchestrated catastrophe dished out by the Chaos Space Marines of the Black Legion, and then having the Imperial Guard show up with the Inquisition to clean things up in Chaos Rising and Retribution campaigns, respectively. After that comes today's subject in 2011 Space Marine that changes the perspective and style completely to a third-person shooter melee action game that has you in the role of a completely different chapter, but I'll leave that for a bit later. But know that this was the end of an era in a sort of way. See, around this time, Relic Entertainment was actually owned by ye olde THQ, which was one of my favorite publishers back in the day because they made a lot of really cool different things. And compared to a lot of the other publishers, they actually can't, wearing ass hats about a whole bunch of like transactions and being greedy and stuff like that. But sadly, they went under because of a bunch of money troubles, and now Sega owns Relic Entertainment. Now that finally leads us to today's subject, which is of course Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine, which is an interesting anomaly in Relic's repertoire of games, because typically the games that they make are all strategy games, so having a sort of third-person shooter melee action hybrid is kind of a weird thing, but thankfully we got it here to play. But the question remains, does it play well in the year of our Lord 2025? And the answer is, maybe. One thing you fellas need to know, if you haven't already from watching my videos the last, however many years, is that on PC, I tend to play my games at 21:9 aspect ratio, or ultra wide as it's commonly known. All this means is that compared to the more standard 16:9, which is the typical widescreen aspect ratio, is that my monitor is wider and thinner, which is closer to the cinematic 2.39:1 aspect ratio that most anamorphic films are shot in. There's several reasons for this choice, but most of it comes down to the fact that I like it a lot more for games because it has a wider, more immersive and cinematic feel, and when I'm editing videos I get way more of the timeline along the bottom that I can fit within my screen, but in general 16:9 is the norm for most of your monitors or TVs out there. I believe I am safe to say that for the most part, apart from the fact that the Anniversary Edition is not a remaster at all, you should be able to play Space Marine on modern systems without much issue. But if you are going to play it on a 21:9 monitor, then there's going to be a few issues with the game. Most notably a stretched HUD, weird FOV, and the cutscenes just kind of being broken to the point that I'm going to be using 16:9 cutscenes that I recorded on another monitor. Along with those issues, you can also tell that this was a late 2000s, early 2010s PC port by the fact that you couldn't even change the damn keybinds on any of the weapons or actions, and it remains that way. And as far as a remaster and stuff goes, I'll leave my final thoughts for that towards the end. For the fellas out there that are on console, well, get ready to dust off that old Xbox 360 or PS3, because amazingly enough, the game is still not backwards compatible on modern systems, which just goes to the sad state of the game at the moment, but hopefully that should answer all of your questions. So fellas, that kind of almost basically brings us to the game, but to destroy your expectations one final time, all this talk of orcs, Space Marines, Imperial Guard, Inquisition, Chaos, what is all this stuff? And so that begs the question of, what's a Warhammer? Fellas, of all the ways that I could introduce Games Workshop and the Warhammer 40,000 universe by saying that it's a tabletop miniatures game, or a satire of heavy metal album covers from the 80s, or the last hope against the darkness out in the cold, uncaring universe. And honestly, the best way that I can describe this whole spiel is that Warhammer 40,000, or 40k for short, is a goddamn institution at this point. In some form or another, we have been pitting Space Marines against Orcs, Space Elfish Eldar, Chaos Space Marines, and so on since all the way back in 1987, when Games Workshop premiered the first edition of Warhammer 40,000 known as Rogue Trader, and man, what a bitchin' cover did it have. Now, while I could go on and on and on about the history of the tabletop game and the factions and how it went from a satirical sci-fi spin-off of their fantasy battle game, we're here to talk about the third-person shooter and its setting. So the best way to introduce the setting is, of course, for me just to narrate the intro to each edition. So fellas, get comfy and close your eyes so I can set the stage for the dark future of the 41st millennium. It is the 41st millennium. For more than 100 centuries, the Emperor has sat immobile on the golden throne of Earth. He is the master of mankind and the master of a million worlds by the might of his inexhaustible armies. He is a rotting carcass writhing invisibly with the power from the dark age of technology. He is the carrion lord of the Imperium for whom 1,000 souls are sacrificed every day so that he may never truly die. Yet even in his deathless state, the Emperor continues his eternal vigilance. Mighty battle fleets across the demon-infested miasma of the warp, the only route between distant stars, lit their way by the Astronomicon, the psychic manifestation of the Emperor's will. Vast armies give battle in his name on uncounted worlds. Greatest amongst his soldier are the Adeptus Astartes, the Space Marines, bioengineered super soldiers. Their comrade in arms are Legion, the Imperial Guard, and countless planetary defense forces, the ever-vigilant Inquisition, and the tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus, to name only a few. But for all their multitudes, they are barely enough to hold off the ever-present threat from aliens, heretic mutants, and wars. To be a man in such times is to be amongst untold billions. It is to live in the cruelest and most bloody regime imaginable. These are the tales of those times. Forget the power of technology and science, for so much has been forgotten, never to be relearned. There is no peace among the stars, only an eternity of carnage and slaughter and the laughter of thirsting gods. Forget the promise of progress and understanding. For in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, there is only war. Man, how horrible, how despair-inducing, and how freaking cool is that for an intro to your game setting? Man, it's one of those ones that I've read over and over and over again through the different editions. But with that being said, that kind of leads us to the Adeptus Astartes, aka the Space Marines. You know that part where they were talking about the Emperor's greatest goons and all that? Well, that finally leads us, to Space Marine. In Space Marine, you play the role of Captain Titus, captain of the Ultramarines 2nd Company, which to some lore nerds out there might get in a tizzy for since it's supposed to be held by somebody else, but they kind of eventually explain it away. You, along with veteran Sergeant Sidonus and the Green Codex thumping newbie Leandros, are sent with a detachment of the 2nd Company to the Forgeworld of Graia to secure the manufactorums that are tasked with the construction of Titans, giant war mechs of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Besieging Graia is an Ork WAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAAA tech on this side of the segmentum, led by the war boss Grimskull that has it personally after Titus trashes his own ship. After a harrowing planet strike to the surface, the whole gang gets together to hopefully overcome an invasion of millions of orcs, secure the manufactorum in the Titan Invictus, as well as save as many baseline humans as they can along the way. Now we gotta put the narrative aside for a little bit, and don't worry fellas, we'll get there. But we gotta talk about the gameplay in the presentation of Space Marine first, and after 14 long years, how does the game hold up? And the answer is, you know what? Pretty damn well, but it's got a few aspects that, didn't hold up so well, so let's talk about that. The visuals of Space Marine are what I could lovingly describe as very much from the era of the 7th generation console, where it has that sort of, this is clearly Unreal Engine 3 sort of look. even though it has its own proprietary engine known as the Phoenix engine if I'm not mistaken. But for some colors they might be too muted and the models might seem primitive to today's standards, but overall I think the game looks fine, but the style is what's keeping it up. Even stuff like the icons still look like it's from a poorly ported Xbox or PlayStation game of the era because, well, it mostly is. But when you've been dealing with poor ports your entire life, it really isn't all that big of a deal. And I look on to small things like this kind of with a little bit of nostalgia. Though I will say that there are some weird stuff going on with the FOV with Space Marine, mostly due to the fact that I'm playing on an ultra-wide monitor, as you can clearly see by me trying different FOV styles throughout the game, but personally it's up to you guys how you want to deal with it. And since we're on gripes as well, one of my other gripes is a sort of visual gameplay one, in that the whole game takes place just on Graia. And apart from the manufactorums, ruined cities, and various other forms of desolation, in a visual sense there's not much variety as I would have hoped. It's really just kind of more of this desolation or this desert planet of Graia. But in terms of visuals and aesthetics, that I find the most interesting is the utilization of the 40k universe as a canvas to have this third-person shooter action game that is both a wonderful reminder of what 40k looked like over a decade ago and remembering some of the discourse around Space Marine when it was being released. For me, Space Marine is what classic 40k used to look like to me, with every single faction still having their old names and appearances, whether it be the Imperial Guard, now known as the Astra Militarum, still being called as the Guard, or Space Marines still running around with Mark 7 armor and calling themselves Space Marines, instead of just Adeptus Astartes, and while some other things such as the Orks just really haven't changed at all. This is going to be nerdy as all hell, but take the Warlord Class Titan Invictus for instance, in that back in the day it looked as it does in game with a very sort of blocky and utilitarian look, and every time when someone wanted to make the models of this type of Titan, they would basically have to make the same sort of blocky design. Fast forward to the future, and nowadays the Warlord Class Titan is modeled after the so-called Mars pattern Titan, which looks a lot like a giant-ass knight shaped into a mech with baroque and ornate weaponry of war that can annihilate entire armies in one fell swoop. And instead, the older, blockier style is still around in a way, but it's dubbed the Lucius pattern, which is the same class of Titan, but styled from the manufactorums of the Forgeworld of Lucius. Another example is what can be seen of the Space Marines themselves, which have gone from the classic Mark 7 armor that we have known for quite literally decades, to the brand spanking new Primaris Space Marines. Just kind of, don't look how long it was since 8th edition, or else you're gonna be, feeling old like me. Which, for the uninitiated out there, are basically the same as normal Space Marines, but quite literally bigger and better. Personally, I'm not really here to say which is better and which is worse when it comes to the OG Marines or the Primaris Marines, more just to say that this game is a sort of time capsule of what games of the era look like, not just in the sense of what the games look like, but also what 40k used to look like during a simpler time when we weren't flooded with Warhammer games, for better or for worse. Like the narrative, which we'll get to, one of the things that the devs were most worried about was the world and the aesthetic of Space Marine and Warhammer in general, because it was kind of just a weird thing. They didn't really want to touch about it too much because, Space Marine and orcs and all these other things. But there's one aspect of the aesthetic that a lot of people had troubles coming to terms with all the way back then, and it's the comparisons between Warhammer 40,000 and the critically acclaimed Gears of War games. If you can believe it or not, all the way back in 2011, there was a lot of discourse surrounding Space Marine and whether or not the game was a ripoff of the much more famous Xbox 360 darling Gears of War, that similarly had big buff guys in giant suits of armor beating the hell out of a not quite human race of locusts that made up a sort of horde, a locust horde, if you will. And if you do the most basic of comparisons, it makes a lot of sense, especially since back then, Warhammer was a thing that only people who orbited around hobby shops and the occasional RTS aficionado would have known about, while Gears of War is one of the biggest Xbox franchises right along with Halo in terms of popularity. Hell, I even remember trying to show trailers of Space Marine to a couple of friends of mine, and when watching the trailer they said, and I quote, bro, this looks like Gears of War but gay. And then I would get comically mad because the thing I really liked was getting made fun of, while all of the rebuttals were falling on deaf ears. No, these aren't locusts, they're literally space orcs. They sound like Australians and they get together for wars called a war, only to once again be reminded that no, that shit's gay, bro. And then the argument would go to, see, they copied the Lancer with that stupid chainsaw, but it's a sword. It's like, dude, that's not a sword, that's a bayonet, and so on and so forth, and it just went on and on and on. And thinking about those times, I'm kind of reminded with how I tried to get them into Warhammer by naively showing them Dawn of War, which is a strategy game, and getting even more mad when they would call those games gay too. Though fortunately, these were just dumbass juvenile arguments, and those two pals of mine are still good friends all these years later. How one of them actually did end up trying Space Marine years later and enjoyed it, but it's just wild how the discourse that time went down. Hell, I might even argue that Warhammer in 40k is bigger and more relevant than Gears is at the moment, and maybe even Halo after all these years, but it don't matter in the end. We're just here to enjoy, what we want to enjoy. Man, one of the things that I absolutely love about doing these retrospectives is going back and thinking about like 16-year-old Tom very sheepishly trying to get his dude bro friends to like pick up a strategy game that he knows they're never ever gonna like in a million years, just because it's like, no, you gotta play Warhammer, bro, you gotta play Warhammer. It's different than Gears of War, it's way better, like, don't worry, bro, It's kind of funny, thinking about that now all these years later, but one of the other things too that I really like is that we get to talk about the gameplay of this game. Oh, I almost got you there for a sec. Yeah, we're going to talk about the gameplay and how in Space Marine it seamlessly goes from shooting gameplay to melee gameplay at a moment's notice. The main gameplay gimmick for Space Marine is basically narrowed down to the fact that in the world of Warhammer 40,000, the Adeptus Astartes are some of the best warriors that the Imperium has at their disposal due to the training and capabilities that transhuman strength and reflexes give them. This means that a single Marine can be just as capable with the handy-dandy bolter to blast his enemies into bloody mulch as he can be capable of using the iconic chainsword to rip and tear the Xenos scum a new asshole. Though in practice and in reality, different Marines develop specializations into the sort of weapons they are best at, ranging from the flexibility of bolters and plasma rifles to the lumbering might of heavy weapons like the las cannon or the plasma cannon or heavy bolter. In terms of gameplay, it means that Space Marine will give Titus a wide variety of tools to get the job done, so it can be done in the manner that you want to complete the liberation of Graia, whether bolter and chainsword in one hand or plasma pistol and thunderhammer in the other. A lot of these weapons are basically just different weapon archetypes that can be found in most shooters, so the average bolter is your assault rifle of sorts, the plasma rifle being a sort of charged energy weapon that, while unleashing a massive ball of superheated gas, also needs to cool down, and then there's the heavy bolter being the emplaced heavy machine gun that you would mow down the masses of enemies with. The shooting mechanics for the most part are really solid, and I don't really have any gripes to say in this regard, apart from a few sections that can be a bit frustrating due to the type of enemies that you will be fighting, but these don't last all too long, and Space Marine gives you the tools to dispatch your foes however you please.
Fuck this shit! Damn, this fucking room and everything went fucking bad. Fuck this shit, man. Fuck.
That could mean using your handy bolter to shoot the advancing orc boys before they get within melee range, and then switching over to your chainsword to rip these poor boys to glorious bits in the name of the Emperor. You can also switch it up with the Stalker Bolter, a sort of long-range, scoped version of the Norma Bolter for those more precise hits, or taking out the Melt-A-Gun to evaporate orcs when a bigger knob gets in your way. And I gotta say, when you see a big guy like that giving you grief then disappearing into a poof of ether, it's a wonderful feeling. As for the melee weapons, you are a bit limited between the chainsword, which is the standard melee weapon of the Astartes, to the more potent power axe that swings a bit slower, but hits harder and comes in handy when you receive tougher enemies later in the game. Finalizing, of course, with the Thunderhammer, which is one of the coolest weapons in the arsenal of a Space Marine that deals immense direct and area of effect damage to those around Titus, though it comes at the cost of limiting the amount of ranged weapons you can use, so in that case, you gotta pick your poison. What's wild about this mix of ranged and melee combat from this game that released all the way back in 2011 is that despite a bit of clunkiness when switching to melee, that for the most part the change between the two is honestly seamless, and I don't really know of any other games that have done it as well as Relic did, and they're primarily a strategy game studio. To cap off this section, I'll talk about a couple of places where they change up the gameplay a little bit. The most common of which is to give Titus a jump pack, which is commonly used by the Assault Marines, which is essentially a giant jetpack that Titus can use to leap into the heavens and then rain down death with the blows of whichever melee weapon he has on hand, causing a great dispersion of orc boys everywhere. Pair that together with the Thunder Hammer and man, oh man, you have a recipe for some of the coolest sections of the game that give you that power fantasy of what it must feel like to be one of the Emperor's Angels of Death. Sadly though, my main gripe with these sections is that they don't last very long, and then you are back to fighting on foot side by side with Sidonus and Leandros again. Another section I really enjoyed that was equally brief but was cool as all hell because it got close to the scale of how big these battles should be is a section where you hop on an Imperial Guard Valkyrie and man a heavy bolter to shoot down Orc Storm Boys on crude literal rocket packs. The scale combined with the rousing soundtrack is genuinely epic, and it feels like a mad dash to get to your objective while there's an endless onslaught of orcs tailing you.
Pilot, match speed. I will shoot them off.
And speaking of soundtrack, we should probably talk about the rousing soundtrack that is used in Space Marine because it's not the best thing out there, but you know what? It just gets the job done, and sometimes that's all you really need. The sounds of 40k can be split into two sections, those being what do the guns and the swords and all that sound like, and what is the music that you'll be blasting, ripping, and tearing into, and for Space Marine both do an adequate job. First and foremost, for the weapons, there's an age-old question of, does the bolter sound right? And the answer is about 50-50, in the sense that the normal bolter doesn't quite sound like it should, sounding more like a heavy assault rifle, but thankfully the Stalker bolter gives us that oomph that we really need. The rest of the weapons sound about right. I especially love to hear the charge and venting of plasma weapons with that very cathartic thump 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 of slugging down large balls of molten energy at these disgusting Xenos. And now onto the soundtrack composed by Chris Velasco and I apologize out there, Sasha Dikisian. I have to say that while it's not as crazy as most other 40k soundtracks, or even comparable to some of the weirder soundtracks that you can find these days with games like Mechanicus or Necromunda, it largely does a really decent job of being equal parts martial and heroic, with an awesome assortment of brass and strings at the right moments. It's interesting as a soundtrack because it doesn't really indulge in the common 40k soundtrack tropes that we think of, like lots of choir vocals or the fake Latin of High Gothic, but goes for a more lean approach that I appreciate, though it does come across as a bit more of an action movie of sorts. But without further delay, and because I don't really know where to put this, we're just gonna have a little showcase of what Space Marine has to offer, all its sights and sounds in one go. So we'll give it to the game so it can do the talking.
That's where the orcs breached the gun battery. We haven't been able to make it inside the wall. There just aren't enough of us.
You have survived this long on your own, Lieutenant. You have done well. But you are no longer alone.
We will retake the gun. You will get your reinforcements.
I'll hold you to that, Captain.
Basically what I got to say is that Space Marine, even though a little clunky in some parts, does an exquisite job of making you feel like you are one of the Emperor's Angels of Death, one of the Adeptus Astartes. And so with the gameplay and all the aesthetics out of the way, we can finally talk about the narrative of Space Marine. And with that, even though there's not a whole huge amount of like twists and turns along the way, I'm going to have a timestamp right here that you can go to, that if you don't want the game spoiled to you and you want to keep going, head on to this timestamp right here and I'll have my final thoughts in the game and all that. But for the rest of us here, hey, we all good? We're all sticking around for this one? Well, I'm just going to say G, but we got to figure out what the hell do the orcs have in store for Titus, Sidonus, and Leandros. So to start off, Titus and the gang are part of one of the companies of the Ultramarines chapter of Adeptus Astartes, which kind of begs the question of what's a chapter? In short, a chapter is a typically 1,000-man organization of Space Marines that used to be part of larger legions 10,000 years back during the Horus Heresies, but after that entire ordeal, the leader of the Ultramarines decided to create the Codex Astartes, which suggested that the legions be split up into 1,000-man strike groupings called chapters to better cover the Imperium and make sure what happened during the heresy never happens again. This being kind of ironic because the Ultramarines have a couple of spare chapters that they can just steal goons from whenever they need to, but that's kind of beside the point, since the most important aspect of this lore is the Codex Astartes. The Codex, not to be confused with the individual army codices from the tabletop, is basically the big book of space marining that Big Bobby G, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, envisioned as the ideal that every space marine should adhere to. Some chapters of Space Marines are Codex compliant, as if to say they strictly follow the guidelines of the Codex Astartes closely, almost as if it was a religion. One such chapter being the Ultramarines, since they kinda created the whole thing. While some other chapters say to hell with the Codex in general and have their own rules, like my brother's beloved Space Wolves, so imagine Space Marines in this game but just Space Vikings. The Codex is used not only as a general guideline for strategies and tactics, but also a set of beliefs and convictions that an aspirant neophyte should take to heart to not just become a better warrior, but to become a better example to the men around him, and one such recently graduated neophyte is Leandros, that seems to take the Codex a little bit too literally, especially when brought in front of a challenging situations of finding a way to complete the planet's strike onto Graia.
Captain Titus, the Orks have massacred the Forgeworld's forces, and they have taken the planetary defense weapons.
Clever of the damned Orks. Keeps us off their backs while they loot the Titan war machine.
Brace for evasive maneuvers.
Pilot, report!
Starboard engine is dead, Sergeant. We are losing altitude.
Get the ship to safety. We'll find another way down.
Aye, Captain. Thunderhawk Lancer Jove returning to launch bay.
This is your plan.
We need to get to the surface to take out the gun battery. Or do you want to go home already, Sergeant?
Not before having a word or two with the Orks.
Is that wise, Captain? The Codex Astartes does not support this action.
Try to keep up.
It's a really neat way that this is how they showed the greenness of Leandros, because it's not like he's stupid and he doesn't know what to do in combat, because to get to that point in being a Space Marine, you have to have seen some combat. So it has that greenness, but also the stoicism of a Space Marine. It would have been a really odd choice if they made him green like the Carmine brothers in the Gears of War series, where their greenness comes from the recklessness in the battlefield, because to even get to the point of being a full-on Astartes, there's not just a whole rigmarole of rituals, human augmentation, and indoctrination to go through, but also years spent as a neophyte where you might likely die if things were to go wrong. So it's a smart choice in my opinion to have Leandros show his green side with not just a comically strict adherence to the Codex Astartes, but also in how he interacts with the guardsmen throughout the journey on Graia. Now, all over Graia, and in reality throughout the Imperium of Man, the actual men and women doing the legwork to keep the various enemies of the Imperium at bay, whether that be the vile Xenos of the Orks, Eldar, or Tyranids, or the Deceit of Chaos, it's up to the Imperial Guard to do the heavy lifting. On Graia, one of the Cadian regiments of the Imperial Guard are tasked with keeping the Titan manufactorum of Ajaxus safe and in the Imperial hands to not fall to the Ork boys, or perhaps even more devious enemies. And like the various chapters of Space Marine, there are an endless amount of Imperial Guard, or as they'd like to be called now, the Astra Militarum regiments for you to choose. The Cadians are basically like the bog standard of an Imperial Guard regiment, just like how the Ultramarines are sort of the poster boys for the Space Marines, and these bog standard guardsmen are led by the not so standard Lieutenant Mira, who is the last real officer on Graia after the command cadre was wiped out. Mira quickly lets us know the situation on the ground and what needs to be done, which in simple terms is to deactivate the orbital gun attacking the relief fleet trying to land, and to secure the Manufactorum complex, the former objective implying that the Orks are led by a particularly cunning war boss and they actually figured out how to use the orbital weapon. Now, I know these interactions with the guardsmen don't tend to last too long for one reason or the other, but I always seem to cherish them because of how they behave towards Titus, Sidonus, and Leandros, and how Titus treats them are really small details that cement these different parts of desperate humanity trying to fight together. The guardsmen always look up to the Space Marine, showing the utmost fealty and honor to walk and fight amongst the Emperor's angels and bringing back that little bit of hope they didn't even know they still had. Meanwhile, the reaction of the Marines is split in the group between the veterans and the Green Leandros, where Titus and Sidonus look at the guardsmen with awe and respect, acknowledging if it weren't for them that the world would have already fallen for the enemy, and that realistically they are doing the heavy lifting. And then on the other hand, you have Leandros that looks at the non-augmented humanity in contempt. They are lesser men that haven't gone through the rigors of what it takes to become an Astartes, and he's there to save the day because of their failure to secure the planet. Well, there's no one exact way that the members of the Adeptus Astartes treat their fellow men, especially normal humans. It is generally determined by what kind of chapter you're dealing with that will tell you what you're in for. Some chapters, such as the Marines Malevolent or the Carcharodons, are completely negligent of civilian and guard casualties to the point that if them dying helps in completing their objectives, they would easily kill them, while other chapters such as the Salamanders, the Blood Angels, or the Lamenters actively go out of their way to protect the innocent. Now, it doesn't seem like a whole lot, fellas, but these tiny little details, these tiny little characterizations go a long way in actually making these characters a lot more compelling than they typically would have, because a lot of these games and these characters in Warhammer, they usually got lore and stories from the tabletop that back it up. But in the case of Space Marine, it's just these three guys, and this is the first story that they're in. Moving on, the boys, and no, not the Ork boys that you're going to be slaughtering in the hundreds, end up going to the orbital weapon and deactivate it once and for all by cleverly putting a melta charge on a shell that the Orks are going to put into the barrel of the gun and fire, causing the whole damn thing to blow up. From there, it's a series of go over here and do that thing so you can go over there and do that other thing, and then it eventually all culminates with the gang securing the site of Manufactorum of Jackus, and with it the thugnificent Warlord Class Titan Invictus, a marvel of the Omnissiah. Just so conveniently, when you get the site secured, you get a distress call from a serval skull of the Holy Inquisition that points us to an Inquisitor Drogon who needs help in securing a secret device. And whoo boy, now that brings us to the chambers of the Holy Inquisition of the Imperium, which is like a mix of the KGB, CIA, and well, the Spanish Inquisition that are tasked with banishing the demon, killing the alien, and burning the heretic, which are regulated by the Ordo Malleus, the Ordo Xenos, and the Ordo Hereticus, respectively. Every time these sons of bitches show up, it means that there's something fishy going on, and the fishiness of these situations are worse than the smell that anyone with an Innsmouth look can give you. This means that when we deal with the Inquisition, that whatever they are doing is clandestine, top secret, and usually immorally ambiguous as all hell, because a lot of the time it has to do with the sedition in the Imperium or the nefarious demons of the warp, which should clue you into something nasty coming our way. Drogon needs help because he has a device known as the Psychic Scourge that, if utilized correctly, might be a way to wipe out all the Orks off the face of Graia, or even, if it doesn't work at all, it could crack the planet in half. But since the Ork War has escalated even further with millions of more Orks landing on Graia, desperate times call for desperate measures, which means we have to use this device that harnesses the power of the warp to psychically kill all the Orks. So, with Drogon in tow, the gang asks Lieutenant Mira for a lift to counterattack the Orks at Drogon's facility, and with it we get that awesome-ass Valkyrie sequence where we are shooting down dozens of Storm Boys before we have to jump ship and continue the assault on the ground, culminating with the purge of Drogon's facility and the firing of the weapon with unexpected results.
Why didn't it work?
Damn that Drogon! Never trust the Inquisition!
Stand fast, Ultramarines. We can handle a few orcs.
Space Marine! Was that supposed to hurt?
Chaos demons! How is this possible?
Ah! Ha-ha! You got new friends now, Space Marine! Inquisitor! Get back!
How heroic.
Drogon!
I have served you well, Lord Nemeroth.
Traitor. I see. My servant did all that I hoped and more. But he would never have succeeded without you, Captain Titus. Thanks to these brave space marines, we have broken through to this reality. The blessed gateway. Clever fool. You seem surprisingly able to resist my touch, Titus of the Ultramarines. And that of the war, which impressed my servant to no end. Ah, you think the Inquisitor a traitor, but Drogon has been dead since before you first met. You have been used by my puppet of flesh and bone.
Ah! Wah! I ain't so easy to kill.
Damn, so it was chaos this whole time? Who could have seen that one coming? Well, okay. Anybody who knows anything about the setting probably saw that one coming a mile away. But this is a nice little like 3/4 of the way sort of reveal, and it brings us a new enemy to fight. And man oh man, it's different alright. Basically at this point, shit hits the fan so hard that the gang needs to course correct their objectives so the forces of chaos don't open the remainder of the portal to the Imperium, also known as the Warp, and complete the demonic invasion of Graia. But this means that we'll have some new enemies to fight, and those are the followers of the Chosen of Nemeroth warband of Chaos Space Marines, which are basically you, but evil. They wield the same weapons as Titus, but more older and corrupted models of your favorite weapons, and knowing how hard they hit against the orcs, you should have your little ultra nuts quaking buddy at what sort of damage they're gonna put up with. At this point in the game as well, this is where we went from a shooty melee hybrid of gameplay styles to a mostly shooty doctrine, because man oh man, the new enemies can drain your health in an instant if you aren't careful enough, and having not played this game in a long while, I guess you could say that I found out what I was doing the hard way. The worst offenders of these new enemies aren't even the Chaos Space Marines, which are actually pretty fun to fight, but are actually the damn Chaos Cultists of the Lost and Damned that join their ranks with the same las guns, or lovingly known as flashlights to fans of 40k. I say they are the worst offenders because they vindicate the age-old adage that a single flashlight against a Space Marine will do piss all, but if you get a dozen of the bastards blasting their guns at you, then you might be in a pickle. And in the case of Space Marine, that is exactly what happens. You move into a new room, get blasted by 10 million cultists, and then slow down as you pick them off one by one, while the demons of Khorne, the Chaos God of War and Bloodshed, send his goons after you. Of course though, we need to give our good old enemy Grimskull one last encounter where we fight him in a boss battle that is much more satisfying than anything else that we've had to do so far in the game. And while not trying to spoil anything in the spoiler section, this is pretty much the only good one all game.
I ain't finished with you yet, Space Marine!
But I am finished with you, Ork.
But regardless fellas, with the legions of chaos on our asses and the chaos gate becoming wider and wider than a Mario Goatsy, we have to head back to our good old pal the Titan Invictus to find a way to destroy the gate, and with the help of the power source and the volcano cannon of this Warlord Class Titan, we can cause some havoc on the orbital spire, but sadly any and all hope needs to be cut a little short.
Sidonus!
At last!
No!
Such a pretty bauble, hiding such immense power. This device is a gift from the Chaos Gods. It holds the key to my evolution, to my ascension to immortal demonhood. My armies will spill humanity's blood across the stars. You continue to resist my touch. Only a deep connection to the warp can explain this. Will you be joining us soon, brother?
Even though he was just a resident smartass and veteran Space Marine, I really did enjoy the inclusion of Sidonus. So with that fellas, we gotta take one out for the team and pour one out for all the homies that lost their lives during the Siege of Graia. Bottoms up. Though in our greatest hour of need, it seems that our calls for help from Graia have been answered, and not just as a relief fleet is on its way, but a couple detachments from the Blood Ravens and the Black Templars chapter of Space Marines have started a full planet strike and helping out what is left of the second company of the Ultramarines. It may not seem like much, but the fact that Relic included their own homebrew chapter into the bigger blockbuster game is awesome, and it gives us some allusions to what the proper ending of Dawn of War 2 Retribution was. The Black Templars, on the other hand, seem to be completely missing from the battlefield, but oh, don't you worry, they'll show up before this is all over in some capacity. At this point, Titus needs to get to the remains of the orbital spire and stop Nemeroth from completing his unholy ritual of ascension towards demonhood. But in the meantime, Leandros will stay behind to cover for Sidonus' body while the apothecary arrives to extract his gene seed. Now, after fighting with your new battle brothers from the Blood Ravens for a little while, you'll be picked up by the same Thunderhawk from the beginning of the game, and you'll make your final dash through the orbital spire, confronting Nemeroth for one final time.
Your dark relic to him. I offer up this world and all those upon it. I ask for the reward that was promised.
You want to talk to your gods? I will send you to them.
Admitted, Titus. The power of chaos is within you, calling to this relic. Imagine the Ultramarines dominating this galaxy in glorious conquest, with you at their head. Imagine the power you could wield.
As a slave to chaos, nothing you say can tempt me from the path of honor, or from avenging the deaths of my battle brothers.
A quick battle against his goons ensues, and then when you're done with them, it's up to Titus to give Nemeroth some mind-expanding information, and through that we've come to the completion of the story. Or have we?
Killing my servants matters little. I am unassailable. The gods of chaos protect me with the very energies of creation.
You forget, Nemeroth. I am no stranger to the touch of the warp.
Perhaps there's something that Leandros wants us to know, and probably has to do with the fact that we've been exposed to the warp numerous times by now.
Look there, Ultramarine. You have saved this world. I see the Ultramarines are human, after all.
More than you know, Lieutenant.
Inquisition is here.
His injuries appear chaos inflicted. You are certain of this charge?
Captain Titus has been corrupted by chaos, Inquisitor Thrax.
I am no heretic!
You lie! Only an agent of chaos could withstand such warp exposure.
I sent the demon to oblivion.
But did you have unholy assistance? We must know. You will submit to my authority, Captain, or the Inquisition must conclude that you have corrupted every Ultramarine under your command. Not to mention those who stand at your side.
Ignore his threats. Come on.
The Inquisition will destroy you, Mira, and the Ultramarines will be forever dishonored. Leave my brothers and the Lieutenant alone. I will come with you. I do not know why I can resist the touch of chaos, but I swear I will discover the truth.
We will discover many truths, Space Marine.
Codex Astartes leaves no room for doubt. You cannot touch the warp and emerge unscathed.
The Codex Astartes is a set of rules. They guide us, shape us as Ultramarines, teach us to hold duty and honor sacred above all. But how we live with those rules is the true test of a Space Marine. And you have failed.
And that was Space Marine, fellas, and I gotta say, after all these years, it's pretty much held up in every single way that I could have imagined it. 14 years after the release of Space Marine, apart from some technical hiccups, I still think that Relic's Space Marine and the story of Captain Titus's journey to save Graia is a pretty decent primer into the 41st Millennium for the uninitiated, and possibly still the best. It introduces most of the main concepts of the Imperium, its forces, and challenges, while also introducing two age-old enemies that show up in all sorts of Warhammer media, that from here I believe that someone has done most of the heavy lifting to figure out where they next want to dip their toes in the grim darkness of the far future. My main two gripes with Space Marine actually has to do with the availability, because somehow, twice in a row, we got a game that is very weirdly priced for what you're getting, and that is the fact that the game has no real remaster for the modern consoles, and the shoddy Anniversary Edition that they have on Steam is criminally overpriced at $70 Canadian or 45 euros. And believe me, fellas, I love this damn game, but there's no damn reason that you should be paying that much for the game and all the DLC bundled in that is practically worthless, since there is almost no one playing the multiplayer these days and you would be hard pressed to find a match to join. Sadly, it seems that the best course of action is to go find a copy of the game for the Xbox 360, dust off that old bad boy, and wait till there's a sale that drastically lowers the price, because even with all of my praise, I can't recommend it at 45 euros or 70 friggin' dollars, dude. You can't. But if you do see it go on sale for maybe 10 or 20 bucks, then I would say it is absolutely worth it, since it's a very fun romp through the 41st Millennium as one of the Emperor's Angels of Death. So whatever happened to the story of Demetrian Titus and Space Marine? Did it ever get a sequel? Was there another game? And you know what? 13 long years after the release of Space Marine, we actually got the release of Space Marine 2. Space Marine 2, which is of course the sequel to 2011 Space Marine, is somehow coming out after 13 long years after the fact, and if you would have guessed that the development of this project has a sordid history, then man oh man, you would have guessed wisely. See, after the release of Space Marine, Relic was tasked by the then publisher THQ to start developing the concept of a sequel for the game with a whole trilogy planned. But sadly, due to the original THQ's financial troubles, the project was canned, and all we have for it are rumors that may or may not be true. Some concepts say that Titus was going to turn renegade after the events of the first game, or taken in by the Inquisition, and even there were some other projects where the Librarium of the Ultramarines would welcome in Titus to become a librarian, which is basically a space marine that can safely tap into the power of the warp and sling that shit back right at them. Sadly, these plans never came to fruition, but strangely, years and years later, when there wasn't even a thought of a sequel for Space Marine, at the Game Awards in the year of our Lord 2021, we were surprised by the reveal of Space Marine 2. This time developed by Saber Interactive and published by Focus Home Entertainment, which has us once again in the shoes of Titus. This time around, the Orks have been switched out for the current great threat that is endangering the galaxy, and that is of course the endless swarms of the Great Devourer. The Tyranids have come to lay waste to the worlds of the Imperium once again. In a game looking much bigger scale with tighter graphics, more bloodshed, and more importantly a ridiculous amount of Tyranids on screen to destroy, will be tasked to save these worlds and stop the Tyranids in their tracks. And by now though fellas, Space Marine 2 has already came out, and I've already played it and enjoyed it so much so that it actually made it into my top 10 of 2024, and boy oh boy was it a great game. But the continuation of Demetrian Titus' saga is for another day, and we will do a full retrospective on Space Marine 2 eventually, but that day is not today. By now, Space Marine 2 has already come out and I've already played it, and man oh man, I loved it. I loved it so much that it actually made it really high onto my top 10 games of 2024 list. But that story for Demetrian Titus, that's a story for another day, and we'll do a full retrospective on it, but just not today. But with that fellas, I gotta say, it was a blast to play through Space Marine. Such a nice little blast from the past, from when around the time that I built my first computer, and so it's nice to play this game and see that it's held up pretty much exactly kind of how I remembered it. But with that fellas, this is the end of the video, and thank you so much for getting all the way here. You made it all the way through the video. I appreciate it, and if you're new here, hey! Welcome to the channel. I hope you really enjoyed this video. If you like this, maybe I suggest you go and watch my other stuff. That would be pretty cool. And if you like that other stuff, maybe subscribe. That would be pretty cool. Just saying. But I gotta say, fellas, this was a blast to play through, and expect more Warhammer 40,000 retrospectives in the future. Just not right now. I'm gonna be doing some other games first, but there will be more retrospectives because man, I really do love making these damn things. So with that fellas, I gotta bid you adieu, and this is Tomthechosen1, and after 1,000 years, I have finally acquired the power of the dark gods, and I'll see you guys next time. Take it easy.